Hi, welcome to Political Perspectives. I'm Cynthia Dickstein. In 2000, George W. Bush lost the popular vote by over 500,000 votes, yet he received 5 more electoral votes than Al Gore and thus became president of our country. 3 other times in our history, the Electoral College voted for candidates who had lost the popular vote, in 1824, 1876, and in 1888. This is because we, the people, do not directly elect our president and vice president. Why not? Here to discuss this with us today, I'd like to welcome 2 very knowledgeable guests. Paul Hilts, who is a writer, historian, and an election integrity activist, and Paul Eckerstrom, the former Pima County Democratic chair and also a recent Obama delegate. This is Paul's 2nd time as a guest on Political Perspectives. He first joined us in May of 2006 when we did a show on impeachment. Times have certainly changed since then, haven't they?
Yeah, they have.
Well, it's nice to have you both here. Paul, can you explain the Electoral College to those of us in the audience who might not really understand how it works?
Well, there's 538 electoral votes, and each state gets a certain amount of votes based on their population, basically based on how many congressmen they have. That's proportional, and then based on the 2 senators they get. And then there's, of course, District of Columbia, which gets 3 just because of proportionality. They don't get it because they have senators, because they don't have senators. So they are apportioned, and then whoever wins the popular vote in each state gets all the electoral votes. And there's people on the slate that have been picked by each party to represent their candidate at the Electoral College. It's voted on in December. But when, like Arizona has got 10 electoral votes, there's 10 electoral members for the Democrats, 10 for the Republicans, and if the Democratic candidate wins, then that person goes, that slate of people go to the Electoral College, and then they actually cast a vote for president, and they're supposed to vote the way their state voted. And there's been only once or twice a few people will stray from that. But and then so if one candidate wins Arizona, they get all 10 electoral votes. That can create these anomalies that have happened in the past. 2000 is the most recent, where somebody gets more electoral votes than the actual aggregate popular vote of the country, and I think that creates a real tension in our system.
Which leads me to ask you, Paul, right. Paul Hilts, what were the Founding Fathers thinking when they created the Electoral College?
The framers had a number of really serious problems to get a place that had 4 million people spread over 1,000 miles with almost no communication from place to place. The largest city by far was Philadelphia, not New York, not Boston. Charleston was almost as big and as influential, and they had no way to talk to one another. And so a national campaign in the way we have now was virtually impossible. And they were afraid very much that the local people would only vote for favorite sons, having never heard of anybody from Massachusetts or New York if you lived in Virginia. And the other thing is, they were playing a very delicate game of balancing influences. All the Southerners, being agrarian and very sparsely populated by comparison, were terribly afraid of being just pushed aside and always outvoted by those people in New York and Boston and Philadelphia. So almost none of the things that we think of as foundations of our Constitution would have made it past both those groups of people, the heavily mercantile and industrial North or the agrarian and sparsely populated South. This was an attempt to keep the majority, the tyranny of the majority, if you will, from pushing aside those southern states.
They also had a very practical reason for doing what they did. Right. The practical reason was they needed to pass the Constitution. They needed 3/4 of the states to actually pass it and ratify it. And so to get enough states, and the smaller states were resisting. They did not want a strong centralized government. There was a couple things that the Founding Fathers put in the Constitution to mollify the smaller states and more agrarian states to go along with having a more centralized government and pass the Constitution. And one of them was the bicameral Congress, where you have a Senate that has, no matter how small your state was, you still got 2 senators, just like New York or Virginia, which were the big states. So that gave them a disproportional amount of power, even though they had a smaller population. Of course, the House was proportional, but if you extrapolate that into the Electoral College, it is proportional in respect of each congressional seat in a state gets an electoral vote. However, it's disproportional in that each state gets 2 additional electoral votes for senators. So Wyoming, who would normally, if it's proportional, would only get 1 electoral vote, actually gets 3, while Florida, which would proportionally would get 25 electoral votes if you just did the House, gets 27. So it gives disproportional power to a little place like Wyoming, even though it's only getting 3 electoral votes. It's got more than it should, proportionally.
I believe we have a graphic that shows that very well, if we can put that up on screen.
There you go.
Okay. And there's also another anomaly here that takes away from the one person, one vote thing, even under this system, and that I understand that it's based on the number of House of Representatives, but the number in the House is based on the population of the state, not the voters. And a lot of those people in those states aren't voters. I mean, they're children, or they're felons in some states, or they're not citizens. So it's a very flawed system. Is that a correct way? Or confusing? Let's come up with an adjective that's accurate.
I think, and Paul might want to comment on this too, the Founding Fathers were all about confusing and separation of powers and making it more difficult to govern, just so that there was this balancing act and tension, so that you know, one person couldn't take over power like the king or a dictator so very easily, and shove through, or like the tyranny of the majority. So that was probably part of the whole thing, and it served us well for many years, obviously. Although it gets in the way sometimes of governing quickly if we need something done in an emergency way. But it served us pretty well. Although I don't agree with the Electoral College. I think it's just the wrong way of doing it.
Okay.
What the framers were desperately aware of was that this whole thing was an experiment. It is still 230 years later, still an experiment. And they were trying ideas. That's why they put the possibility for amendment right into the Constitution, because things might change and we might have got it wrong the first time. What they were absolutely convinced that they were not wrong about was that everybody's interest has to be accounted for. And just because you live in Delaware does not mean you should never be heard from again. And there was no way that Philadelphia was going to give up its power when it had it. And so under the law, there had to be a way to protect those interests. They were desperately afraid of both tyranny of a small group, a bunch of plutocrats, and they were afraid of tyranny of the majority, where, among other things, John Adams had, you know, with the common interpretation is that we're trying to protect against the majority running wild, and there's mob rule. After all, in France, they had just started their own revolution, and it was desperately bad. It was desperately bad. So that John Adams, when he looked at this, was all in favor of the one house being just like the British House of Lords, appointed for life and appointing themselves the king, or president in his case. You know, it'd be King John Adams, and they were afraid of those Jacobins who would, unknowledgeable and unwashed and having no interest, having no property, you see, not being otherwise good citizens, would take over with their ignorance.
But you know what? We've already got a lot of that into the Constitution. The Senate already takes into account a lot of that and is a real backstop for smaller states and smaller interests or minority interests to be taken into consideration. I have a problem with the Electoral College because we've had these anomalies where a president is elected without the popular vote, and it leaves a majority of the people pretty cold about their democracy, and it leaves them feeling empty about it. I mean, if you look in history, when Andrew Jackson didn't get it and when John Quincy Adams won, the country was practically in revolution, and certainly Andrew Jackson was fomenting that, and he certainly got swept in the net in 4 years later because of that. And I think in each time, Rutherford Hayes was a very ineffectual, like John Quincy Adams, ineffectual president because he didn't have the popular vote. Now, George Bush seems to have been a very effective president in doing his policies because he got into power and did what he wanted. He just threw off, and unfortunately he had the Congress with him on this, and has done, I think, great damage to our democracy and to our society. And just think of it: if we had a popular vote, he wouldn't have been president. 8 years later, we wouldn't be in the situation we are in now.
That's right.
But the two examples that Paul uses are really instructive. First of all, with Andrew Jackson, they were ignoring on the East Coast a huge rush of sentiment against the plutocrats who lived in mansions on top of hills and had all the money and all the power. And so once Jackson got in, as the first person not born to money and influence in the East, he was born in a log cabin for real and spent all his life fighting Indians. For better or worse, that formed him as a person, and we became a one-party government because these people had been suppressed for so long. You know, 49% is still a minority, but it's a very large one, and if you ignore it, you do so at your peril.
But I have to say, I mean, Andrew Jackson didn't get in the first time because the popular vote was ignored, and because of the Electoral College, and that was unfortunate.
Well, I understand that when the Founding Fathers were doing this, one of the things they couldn't agree on was whether the president should be elected by the popular vote or by Congress. So that was a big battle. And the other thing that really makes it kind of an anomaly for our times is that they didn't believe in, that they thought that political parties were evil and that gentlemen shouldn't campaign.
That's
right.
So therefore, that's why that pushed
and as good Democrats, we agree completely.
But that pushed it more towards the Electoral College. But you know, the big question is, what does that say about democracy? I mean, shouldn't it be one vote, one person?
And that's the principle that we've been enunciating now for quite a time in terms of the Supreme Court looking at the Constitution. And if that's the case, then why we still got the Electoral College? The only way it can be changed is by constitutional amendment, which is problematic. It's very problematic because, again, you need 2/3 vote in both houses, the Senate and the House, to pass it, which is difficult. The president needs to sign it, and then it goes to the state legislatures, and you need 3/4 of the state legislatures to pass it, to ratify the amendment to change this, so that we have a popular vote and a true democracy, at least as to our executive branch. The problem with that is there's a lot of small states out there that are benefiting from the Electoral College, like Wyoming, and you better believe that both their senators would vote against it, let alone their legislature if it gets to that point. And I'm not sure it's ever going to happen because of that. It should happen because, as Paul said before, we don't have problems of communication and knowing who our candidates are. They get on TV and everybody gets to see them and see what they talk, how they talk, and what they're about. It's a whole different world, and we certainly have the ability to have a more pervasive democracy, especially when it comes to, let's face it, the president is our most important office, our figurehead, and if we're going to be the symbol of democracy around the world, they should be elected popularly.
But what happens, and I can see this being maybe a problem with the popular vote. Suppose you have, say, 3 candidates running, and the first two, the 2 most popular, split the vote, and therefore the minority candidate, the one with the fewest votes, still has more than the 2 who represent the majority of the people. Isn't that a real
Well, they don't represent
problem?
The majority of the people because they're 2 people that didn't get as many votes. I mean, they're different people. They're different. They may have a slightly different philosophies. Maybe they're similar, but you know, sure. I mean, that's a possibility. We've had presidents that didn't get a majority of the vote. Bill Clinton's a perfect example. Didn't get a majority of the vote, and so I don't see why that's a problem.
And Ross Perot had 20% of the popular vote but not one electoral vote because he wasn't strong enough in any one region really to sway people.
And remember, Abraham Lincoln was elected just that way.
Right.
The Democrats split their vote among a Southern Democrat who got in as a third-party candidate against Stephen Douglas, who was a Northern Democrat, and Abraham Lincoln won the election because with not a majority of the vote. So, it's okay. I think that's okay.
There's also a subtext that should not be ignored. It is actually at the heart of why we retained this system. They had the chance several times to change it. There have been proposals, some 700 proposals to change it.
Really?
But it's not just the requirements in Congress to change it. It's that by itself, there has always been this other argument that was right there in the beginning when we wrote the Constitution. We fought a war that killed 700,000 Americans, and we still couldn't settle it. And today, we are still arguing about it. The political parties have changed their names and moved all over the country about it. It is, do you have local control of your own destiny, or is there a strong central government? Early on, the name of our party was the Democratic Republicans, because this is a republic, but we wanted one person, one vote. It's a little cumbersome to have 305 million of us walk to Washington to vote, as they did in Athens. So you have this republic, but we wanted it to be representative. The Democrats were for dispersing the power, small central government. The Republicans, when they finally transmogrified from the Whigs, were for strong central government. That's what the Civil War was about. It was about retaining a union with a strong federal character.
Well, which is kind of an interesting dynamic, is Thomas Jefferson wanted, he believed that people were good and the masses could elect people, but at the same time he also wanted a more federal system where you had states having more power than the central government. Really a strange dichotomy there, because that's one of the arguments that caused the Electoral College, which I think is very undemocratic and doesn't trust the people.
We agree on everything. It is that fight between the strong central government and the states that is at the very root of all this. And if you are, because all the laws that say who gets to be an elector, they're not in the Constitution. They're not in the U.S. Code. They're in the state laws.
Sure.
They want to retain those powers to the states.
Now, here's the practical political ramifications of all this.
I wish I could get both of you to talk.
Yeah, right.
It's just wonderful. Go ahead.
We don't care about this at all.
As a Democrat, most Democrats live in big urban areas, and most Republicans live in the smaller rural areas. And frankly, we have lost a lot of presidential races, I believe, because of the Electoral College. Gives much more power to those smaller states, those more rural states, and the people in the bigger cities are not getting the same representation in their government as those people, including in the Senate, but also in their presidents. And I think, as a Democrat, I'd like to see that evened out, mainly because it's the right thing to do, but also because I would like to see us win more elections.
So it does become a partisan thing then. It's not
yes.
just a question of smaller states versus larger.
I would think the Republicans, if there was a constitutional amendment moving forward, the Republicans would fight it because of that, yes.
There's also the practical aspect. Once you're in Congress, once you have got your representatives and your senators there, then how are you ever going to have a presidential candidate care what happens in Arizona or Wyoming if it's all about the population of New York and Chicago and Los Angeles? Why would anybody care what Arizona needs?
Oh, I disagree with that. Because there's votes to be mined all over the country, and candidates would have to go. Right now we go to what?
Why?
Maybe they go to about 15 states, and in the primaries the small states seem to rule as well, Iowa and New Hampshire. So we're electing our president going through all the small states and all the smaller rural areas, rather than where people really are, which is almost the vast majority of us now live in cities. And so, and by the way, Arizona, most people live in cities. There's hardly anybody in the rural areas in Arizona.
Right.
But I think so. I think a presidential candidate would come here in a millisecond. He could hit two cities, big cities, fairly quickly and get almost all of the Arizona population in Phoenix and Tucson.
Right.
Well, this is where, what is it, Maine and Nebraska have? Can we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, we
because
should.
that...
Right. And not only are Maine and Nebraska the only two of the 50 states who split or have in theory the ability to split their electoral votes, they never have, in fact. In real history, they have not. But Colorado tried recently.
No, they did. This time. Obama won one of the
this
Omaha.
time it's finally official?
Obama won, I think it's official, won the Omaha Congressional District in Nebraska.
Right.
And so even though McCain won Nebraska, he got one electoral vote, or will get one electoral vote out of that congressional district.
And this is historically important and correct to note because the way they can split their votes in Maine and Nebraska both is by congressional districts. They have 2 statewide votes, and then even they would give 1 vote to each congressional district, so that the 8th district where I live, where Gabrielle Giffords is in the House, we would get 1 representative voting for Obama. Because down here, yeah, he wins. But in Maricopa, they wouldn't want to hear from that, of course. And so they would have their congressional district, like everything representing Maricopa would be voting for McCain. And that's swell. The only problem is that, first of all, historically it has not happened before. It'll be really interesting to see if this has any effect on anything. But Colorado did try to go to a strictly population-based proportional vote, and they voted it down themselves.
Yeah, but the problem is it's still not proportionally based because you still have those 2 senators getting elected statewide, which, I mean, those 2 Senate ones that are represented by senators, those 2 electoral votes.
Right.
And that's still wrong. And it still gives disproportional power to Wyoming versus a bigger state. And so, it's not proportional. It's not democratic. And it should be proportional like the House of Representatives is. That's the way I look at it. And frankly, the smaller states already have lots more power given to them in the Senate because they get 2 senators in one of the chambers of the Congress. So I don't see why, frankly, I don't see why the Founding Fathers gave away the store. They could have gotten those votes just by giving them the Senate.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a problem here. I mean, everything that I've read says that the chance of ever doing away with the Electoral College is almost nil because of getting the states to ratify it. And one of the ways that it might happen is if you got popular opinion behind it. However, when I talk to certain friends about this, I'd say, well, what do you think about the Electoral College? And one of my friends had the best answer. She said, well, I liked it this year. And so... But that's probably very typical. Things went well this year for her. The Electoral College was great for her candidate. Right. She hated it in 2000. Other people feel the reverse.
But the Electoral College worked this time, but also the popular vote went heavily for Obama as well. So it did. God forbid, though, we have more situations like in 2000 and those other years, because eventually that erodes public confidence in our democracy. They get angry. They realize this isn't really a democracy.
They don't vote.
And then they don't vote.
But in fact, we have had several opportunities to change. They changed the Constitution. The founders themselves were still there in 1804, and they looked at the election of 1800 and said, what a mess. We made a big mistake making the vice president the second biggest vote getter rather than the party. They had not allowed for parties in the beginning, and they realized after a while no one was going to be able to win an entire national election on his own. And so they had these parties, and they had to deal with them. So when they had the option in 1804, they could have done away with the entire Electoral College, gone right ahead. And they did not. And they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, but they hadn't had the election of 1824 yet.
Well, many things, though, have happened. I mean, we have evolved, and issues come up. And one of them, you're both, without getting sidetracked, both very heavily involved in election integrity. Well, during the Founding Fathers, you couldn't steal votes or tamper with them, to use a more polite word, with electronic voting machines.
No, but they still did it at the local level
well, they did
in other
it,
ways. Yeah.
But you know, with the Electoral College, and some people who support the Electoral College say you can't do this because you can't predict, but it seems to me we can predict very well where the close states are, and it's much easier to tamper with votes, I'll be polite, with the Electoral College than with a one vote per person in a national election.
And some of the states have laws that say the person who is our elector must vote with the popular outcome, and some don't.
No, but I'm talking about the machines themselves when the votes get calculated differently.
In fact, I was born and raised in Chicago. I've worked in the party, in Democratic Party in New York City and here, and I have seen every kind of election there is, from hand raise and voice acclamation to touch screens. There are ways to cheat every election if that's what you need.
I have to tell you, it's less likely where you're going to get cheating going on when you have a pervasive vote all across the country. When what we saw in 2000, Florida, there was a lot of shenanigans that went on in Florida because that state's 27 electoral votes was key. And so a lot of stuff happened at the local level in a state that made a big difference in the election. Now, it's easier to control that situation in terms of maybe fixing an election in a smaller setting than in an entire election across the country. And so I would say that doing it by getting rid of the Electoral College would help us keep from that fraud happening.
We're almost at the end of the show. So I have to ask you now, Paul, I think I know your answer. You would absolutely do away with the Electoral College.
Yep, if I was the king of the world,
you would
I'd definitely do that.
Right.
Paul Hilts, would you what would you do?
I have long been split, but in the last 5 elections, I've decided we need the Electoral College because of that minority that you dare not ignore.
Okay. I want to thank you both, Paul Hilts, Paul Eckerstrom. Fascinating conversation, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we'll leave you with a quote, as usual. Americans have sent a message to the world that we have never been just a collection of red states and blue states. We have been and always will be the United States of America. I probably didn't say that as eloquently as President-elect Barack Obama did on November 4th, 2008, but I think we share those sentiments. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to both of you.